you to the third annual DLA Piper Canada Corporate Crime Compliance and Investigation Symposium. This is the 6th installment this year, and we're very excited to bring this panel to you. I get the pleasure of moderating and learning from these brilliant and incredibly knowledgeable voices, thought leaders in this field. So what we're going to be doing is doing a panel presentation where I'm going to be asking questions. We, of course, invite you to also add your questions to the chat. And if we have time at the end, we will go through them. And if we run out of time, we will definitely respond in writing. So please do add questions to the chat. My name is Amy Pressman, and I'm a partner in the Advocacy, Compliance, and Environmental Law Group at DLA Piper Canada. And I would like to invite you to meet our wonderful speakers. The first is Kristy Balsanek. She is the global co-chair of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Group at DLA Piper. She has more than 20 years of legal experience practicing in both global law firms and in-house roles, so she brings an interesting perspective to the discussion. She focuses on core environmental, social, and governance-related risk areas, including business ethics, corporate governance, director and officer duties, anti-corruption, sanctions, global supply chain transparency, labor, human rights, gender equity initiatives, climate change, and it goes on. She serves as a trusted advisor, supporting their transition toward creating long-term value and sustainability. So I look forward to her insights. I'd also like to introduce you to Scott Morrison, who is a partner in PwC's ESG reporting and assurance practice. He's assisted many organizations in building trust around sustainability and has worked with clients to help meet their non-financial assurance needs. His expertise includes engagements on a variety of ESG topics, including GHG emissions, IFRS sustainability standards, TCFD, Scope 3 financed emissions, and sustainable finance. He also sits on the AASB's Sustainability Advisory Committee. I also am pleased to introduce Jennifer Singhal, who is the Senior Director of Risk and Compliance, and she was formerly the Associate General Counsel at Benevity, Inc., which is a leading provider of global corporate purpose software headquartered in Calgary, Alberta. In her work, Jen leads the teams that are directly engaged with Benevity's investors to fulfill and support their ESG and impact program requirements. And I'm sure you will see her passion for the topic and the deep knowledge that she has. So just to start off, Kristy, perhaps we can start with you. In really quick terms, what is ESG at its most fundamental level?
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all for your participation today. It's great to be on here with our co-panelists, and thanks so much for the introduction. So, great question, and a lot of different meaning on ESG. I'm sure everyone here could have, their own different definition, but as a baseline, I would just propose that ESG is essentially, it's an overarching framework, right, for understanding and managing a company's risks, environmental, social risks, and the impact of those risks that the company has in terms of the community it's in terms of the world, in terms of people and planet. And if we look at the different ESG factors, those can really vary depending on environment, with climate change, with water management, biodiversity. On the social side, of course, we would have things for diversity inclusion, for human rights, forced labor issues, for example. And then the G, which is actually really important, and we'll be talking a lot about that today in terms of oversight and controls around on the governance side. So really each of this is really unique to each company. I think that's important to remember for ESG. It's important to have a stakeholder assessment. It's important to tie the ESG factors in terms of company strategy, what those goals are. And really the change that we've seen, because of course companies have looked at environment and social governance, of course, for decades. However, the change that we're seeing, and when we think of the definition of ESG, is around transparency, the enhanced expectation for scrutiny, transparency on these topics is very much in the focus, as well as, of course, the look at the value chain, so that it's not just your own company or firm, but the entire value chain of all the tier one suppliers and so on that we'll speak to as well. So those are really the changes that are creating those risks. And so the legal compliance accounting piece of this is really critical. So it's a really important question, Amy, and look forward to that discussion today.
Thanks, Kristy. That's a very helpful explanation. So perhaps for a different perspective, I can turn it over to Jennifer. Can you advise of the business application of what is ESG?
Yeah, and I mean, Kristy nailed it in terms of explaining what it is essentially a fairly, ambiguous concept sometimes. It is, at its base, just a framework that allows us to assess our risks. We also sort of think of it as quite a bit, or could be more than that, right? It is a tool that can help organizations express their purpose or their corporate purpose through these different buckets of environmental, social, and governance. It's a way for organizations from a strategic lens to build a foundation and a framework to become a sustainable business. And that's kind of a buzzword in this space these days. But when I think of sustainability, I think of it literally. Like, how do you build a business that can be sustained and be valuable and profitable over a long-term time horizon? And so managing these specific risks is intended to really help set up the organization for long-term success as well. And then the cool thing that's going on in the space these days is we're talking a lot about sustainability in terms of that kind of equilibrium that's created when you're not extracting more than you're taking so that you can be sustainable. But there's this trend towards regeneration as well. You hear a lot about that in this space of not just going, okay, net zero, but actually how do we add back into people and planet so that as an organization, we're actually a +1, not just a -1 or zero. So that's kind of how we think about the space, as well as being the nuts and bolts of the framework itself.
Thanks, Jennifer. So Scott, do you have anything to add from your perspective about what is ESG at its most fundamental level?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much for having me here today. And I would say, Kristy and Jen did a great job explaining it. I totally agree that, it is that kind of umbrella and really fundamental to organizations' risk, but as well their opportunities. It would be helpful also just to maybe share a little bit of a different angle in terms of what we're seeing happen in the marketplace, focused on ESG. And it's really driven by some key stakeholders, whether that's the investors in the capital market space. There's a huge focus. A couple of years, there's the capital forming the environment, driving environmental or social benefits. So as a result of that, we've kind of seen the emergence of things like sustainable finance. The banks were offering, these avenues of financial instruments for companies to, drive environmental benefit, transition the social benefit through various projects. The other interesting thing too, in that kind of investor side of things, is large asset managers and pensions, they're starting to calculate their carbon footprint associated with the capital they're deploying. And very important for companies to set a key stakeholder. And then the big areas why we're really seeing companies ESG is, again, employees. There's lots of things out there that support that employees want to work for companies that perform well in the ESG area, whether that's doing good for the environment stuff. Again, pretty critical for human capital. And then I think something that we've just seen really develop in the last little bit is the customers as a key stakeholder. So companies are actually increasing the supply chain and ESG expectations they're working with. So again, the important piece for organizations to address those customers base as it relates to any ESG expectations, because there's that direct link to revenues, certainly. So lots of talk and strategies that organizations are building around ESG.
Thanks, Scott. We've had a couple of comments that we can't hear you very well. Your microphone isn't coming through clearly, so I'm not sure if you're able to move closer or perhaps dial in a different way.
I'll try to fix that.
Sure. Okay, so while you're doing that, I'm going to ask Kristy if she could build on that and explain to us whether there's anything new or specific to the US that is particularly relevant or emerging right now? I think there's lots to talk about there.
No, absolutely. And I think building from the framework that we just described, and looking at least in the US right now, there is a number of layers of change that we're seeing and trends that companies are looking at. And I'll start at the US on the federal level. So I think we'll be speaking about the EU separately. Obviously, I'm a US lawyer, but for those of you who may know, there's a direction that the EU is heading, which I know Scott will speak to. But in terms of the US, unlike the EU, we don't have a mandatory reporting directive at the federal level. Right now, what we have essentially at our US Securities and Exchange Commission. So for public companies, there is a proposal on the environmental side for disclosing greenhouse gas emissions. And that proposal was made in March of 2022. It was expected to go final in April of 2023, but it's now October 2023, and the second half of October. It's on the calendar for the SEC this month, but we are waiting to see if the final rule will be issued. And that will be a change because while of course right now public companies in the US are required to disclose on their material risks through their standard public reporting, this new proposed rule from the SEC would be a prescriptive mandatory disclosure for greenhouse gas emissions and the certain risks around that. And so that would be new. And it's right now looking at whether that would include scope 1, what we call scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3 emissions. And that can be ranging from the emissions that you as a company own or that you procure, or through the entirety of your value chain, which is quite broad on the scope 3. So we're looking to see what will come out on the SEC side. A lot of public companies already are acting as though that rule is in place, even though it's not, but thinking about how to approach it. And it would be a very prescriptive strategy and a change for companies. And even private companies may think that they wouldn't be caught in that if it goes forward. But the reality is a lot of the companies that private companies work with that are public will then be looking at that throughout their value chain. So even though it may not be required from the SEC standpoint, there still would be potentially a commercial or business strategy around thinking about how to interact with publics that may have to comply if the rule comes forward. So that's a really significant piece on the SEC side at the federal level. Of course, we're also looking on the social side at the SEC. There's some discussion, I know Scott mentioned about human capital management and thinking about human capital and disclosures there. So there's some discussion around what that could potentially look like as well in the future. So monitoring that. And then at the state level, you may have heard that there's a new first in state disclosure rule that California recently signed, the governor signed October 7th. There's 3 bills relating to climate disclosure that have come forward. And for those of you familiar with the US, California often leads in these types of topics. And so this is a first in the country in terms of disclosure around greenhouse gas emissions, risk, and related to that and claims. So there's quite a lot to follow in this space. And of course, the other piece that I would also mention, of course, relates on the social side on forced labor. I know in Canada, you have a new Modern Slavery Act, which we will hear about. But in the US right now, we have, for those who have a business with Xinjiang, with the province in China, there is forced labor prohibitions there, which our US Customs is enforcing. And so that's a very large issue, as well as issues around child labor and concerns around that. And then we have to mention the anti-ESG. In the US, there are a number of states that have issued at the state attorney general level concern and investigations, certain boycotts around certain issues around investment on ESG. And so a lot of companies are trying to navigate with the state level and what those look like and thinking about how to navigate at these various legal regimes. So I'll stop there, but there's certainly a lot to talk about and would love to hear more what's happening, Scott, on your side with the EU and some other jurisdictional areas.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm happy. Can you hear me all right? Is it a little bit better?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, good to know. Kristy gave a really good background in terms of what's going on in the U.S. marketplace on the regulatory side. And just want, is my audio okay, Amy?
It seems to be a little bit choppy, but
Okay, I'll call it. Maybe if you skip to the next question, I'll call it.
perfect. Okay, we'll come back to you, Scott. Thank you. So Jennifer, perhaps you could provide the perspective of industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I know Scott's going to talk a lot about what's going on in the EU, and so as a Canadian company, Benevity is privately held, so that's a good context I think to lead with. Um, we are watching these regulations unfold just like everyone else is in the space, and our legal and risk teams are preparing on a regular basis to make sure that we're able to comply when we're required to comply with the laws when they do apply to us. So in our own right, we're making sure that we understand the laws and that we've done our gap assessments and that we're ready to act when we need to. As a SaaS company that provides corporate purpose solutions to, I think we're over 950 of the world's most iconic global brands. So if you think of a global iconic brand, we probably work with them and help their social impact and corporate purpose programs really come to life through their employee engagement programs and their philanthropic or community investment programs, and other volunteerism and all of that. We're actually kind of at that front end of the wedge trying to figure out how we can help that community be prepared for responding to these regulations, not just from a compliance exercise point of view, but also how they can use these regulations to really accelerate their value drivers and their strategic goals around their organization's corporate purpose program. So we're looking at these regulations from two lenses. We're going, how do we need to respond to them? And also, what can Benevity do? We're clearly on the S of ESG, I would say. We're focused on charitable donations and volunteering. So how can we really help organizations, when it's time to measure and it's time to report against your impact on those programs? How are you going to be able to do that through technology and the programs that you do? So that's kind of where we're at in this space right now. But the one thing I was going to say is we're kind of approaching it the same way we approached GDPR, which is to say, even before the law was a law and we had to all respond to the new requirements, we always intended to have a privacy program that had baked in principles that allowed us to kind of flex with whatever the highest and hardest jurisdiction of the land was in terms of privacy laws. And so as a Canadian company, that was actually pretty straightforward because Canadian privacy laws have always been pretty robust around those broad principles of consent. So if you put those pieces in place in your organization, when the laws come in and you're doing your gap assessment, your gap assessment's going to be a lot smaller than if you just approach it net new when the laws come in place. So by analogy, we're approaching that on the ESG side and saying, okay, if we already have a mechanism in place for measuring our carbon emissions and our GHGs and our scope 1, 2, 3s, and we're already in the process of reporting that on a regular basis, when it's time for us to actually go and meet a compliance requirement, it's not going to be a huge leap to get from here to there. We're going to be already have the wheels in motion, so to speak. So that's kind of how we're approaching it strategically and watching very carefully.
Thanks, Jennifer. So Scott, let's try again.
Yeah, let's hope third time is a charm. So if you can hear me okay. Is it sound okay, Amy, on your side?
Seems better.
Yeah.
Okay. So on the regulatory side here in Canada, I would say that we've also seen some developments. Canada was actually one of the first jurisdictions around the world that came out with some regulation, and they came out with the climate regulation almost 2 years ago. And compared to what came out subsequently globally, I would say it didn't have that much teeth. So what they really did on the global side is they said, we're going to take our foot off the gas and really assess what the SEC is doing, what Europe is doing, and what some of the international standards bodies are doing. So Canada is probably going to give an update in the next coming month, and it's expected that they're going to align with the international sustainability standards. So that's the new standards that has been set up through the ISSB to kind of create that global baseline for sustainability reporting. Because the big challenge in the marketplace to date is it's kind of been a little bit of an alphabet soup of different ESG frameworks, standards, and guidelines out in the marketplace. So came very welcome when the International Sustainability Standards Board was set up to really create that global baseline. I know certainly from the investor community, it was something that they were pleased to see. Again, comparing apples to apples versus apples to orange in the sustainability marketplace. So there's a lot there for organizations to start to think forward. And what we're starting to see in the Canadian marketplace is a lot of organizations starting to pivot to the ISSB and really assessing, well, what does this mean for our reporting? What does this mean for our data collection? And again, what does this also mean from a sensitivity perspective? Because there's a whole lot more that companies are now going to need to report in the marketplace. So certainly, a positive thing, but it's a lot of work ahead for preparers and obviously even legal groups as part of various organizations have a big role to play in terms of reviewing it and making sure it's fit for purpose, especially if this information is starting to migrate into filing documents and things like that as well.
So Scott, materiality assessments are frequently discussed. From a general perspective, can you explain what that refers to and what practitioners need to watch out for?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say materiality is a pretty fundamental piece of sustainability and sustainability reporting in particular. It's really, and I think Kristy kind of mentioned this at the upfront, it's about kind of engaging with your stakeholders and identifying what are those material areas, material risk and opportunities that you should be focusing on, but also reporting on. ESG, it is so broad. There's so many things under the E, so many things under the S. And again, companies shouldn't be reporting or trying to, tackle all these types of issues, especially if it's not relevant to organizations. We have seen a number of organizations fall into that trap where they're trying to focus on too much. It starts to dilute even the return on investment if they're trying to solve all these issues and focus on it. But you also can fall in the trap of even reporting quantity over quality. And as you can imagine, there's also that risk of greenwashing too if you're just putting a ton of information out in the marketplace. So I would say, you really want to double down on the point that going through a materiality assessment, which can look like engaging with your investors, your customers, your employees, and really assessing what are those material ESG topics that the company should be focusing on, but also looking at things like your enterprise risk management systems and identifying some of those key risks to your organization can help influence companies in determining what's material for them. So, you also mentioned about the kind of what's going on with double materiality and the concepts there. So there's a little bit of a different, position on that, I would say. So in our North American markets, what we've seen from the regulators is a very investor focused, linking back to enterprise value materiality view on this, versus some of our friends over in the European market have taken, that double materiality view, which essentially means it's not only including that enterprise value and link back to financial results and kind of the future prospects of an organization, but also the impact piece of it. So what is the organization doing that is having impact on the societies in which it operates in, the environment and areas like that? So it's a new concept, and I would say, well, it's not a new concept, but it's new to a lot of organizations in going through that assessment and understanding what is the impact that they're having on the environment and society as a whole. So again, quite a different position that the European markets are taking, but we're also seeing some North American companies focusing on this because they have European operations as well.
Thanks, Scott. So Kristy, perhaps you could explain where double materiality for business operations in North America actually fits in and whether it is a legal requirement here, and touch on the role for lawyers in this aspect.
Sure. I think building off of what Scott said, so we mentioned on the EU side, and I think Scott will share a little more about with the EU, the Corporate Sustainability, the Reporting Directive. And it's sort of a lot to say, but it's known as the CSRD, which went into effect in 2024 for certain companies, and there's a phase in from there. In terms of reporting, that involves what we're calling a double materiality assessment. So we talked earlier about the impact that the climate, so that on the SEC side, at least in the US, the SEC is looking at the impact that companies may face from climate change and other climate risks. But in the EU, not only do they want to understand the impact of climate on the company, but it's also what's the company impact on the environment. So we call that a double materiality. So that's a distinction between right now with the US and the EU. So companies have to think about if they're reporting in the EU, if they will be reporting, that double materiality standard is quite important. And so, that's something that we'll need to take a look at and thinking about as a company, what that strategy would look like, depending on the results of that assessment. And then what Scott was speaking to in terms of a materiality assessment. So in terms of thinking about stakeholders, so this is a different type of assessment where Scott mentioned thinking about your investors, your customers, your employees, and everything that Scott described, thinking about what's important to them, what are their expectations, and how that aligns then with the company strategy, and then potentially this materiality piece of impact of the environment on the company and vice versa. I would just add, as a stakeholder, speaking from the legal side, there of course is the regulator. And, it may be strange to think of, the stakeholder, but just in terms of the ESG framework, thinking of stakeholders, it includes regulators, which means it's also important as part of that materiality assessment is to understand what's the legal framework. And Jen mentioned that, right? And from her side, she wants to know, our clients want to know, what is the legal framework? What do we have to comply with? And so in addition to these overall stakeholder engagements and discussions, the legal piece is really critical with that, to understand what the laws are. Do they apply? Do they not apply? And thinking about as well, making sure that assessment, of course, considers the attorney-client privilege, and thinking about assessment with the role of privilege and the role that, if there is something later with regulations, and depending where regulations go, if things go sideways with some sort of regulatory enforcement or with some sort of litigation, which I know we'll talk about. For example, right now in the US, you may be aware at the US Securities and Exchange Commission, there's actually a task force now. It's the ESG and climate task force that is looking at companies and whether or not what they are reporting in their SEC disclosures is accurate. And if it's not, then there have been enforcement actions already against a few entities, which we can discuss. But the important piece is that thinking about, and especially those who are participating on this call, where the privilege piece comes in, because that may be something a little bit new for companies to think about when they're assessing, these different types of regulatory requirements.
Thanks, Kristy. So Jen, can you share a little bit about how some of these concepts that we've just been discussing have been applied to Benevity, and how you've worked with your organization to ensure that ESG is not just a compliance exercise?
You bet. I always find it funny when we talk about double materiality or materiality in general outside of a legal audience. It's like a net new concept, but lawyers get it, because it's like, well, how could you possibly build a framework without knowing exactly what's relevant to material to your business, right? It's a very common concept. So, but the double materiality piece sometimes catches people. It's what's material to your business and also the world that you are impacting at the same time. So we're lucky here at Benevity. We're a B Corp. And one way you could describe us is that we're software as a service company, but also impact as a service. And so we're really fortunate in our investor consortium to have 3 of some of the largest global impact investors in the space. And our majority owner, HG Capital in the UK, have kind of taken that materiality piece off the hop and done it for us in some ways. Every year they run their responsible business program, which includes, they've already assessed the software landscape and figured out what those key areas are year over year for all software companies when they're doing an ESG assessment against their portfolio. So they'll send their big questionnaire to us, and it's already adapted for the sorry, am I sounding like a robot? It's already been adapted for this industry. So that's kind of the first level of relevance and materiality. And we'll go through that exercise. And then once we understand our data around our E and S and G, the business will actually go back through and say, okay, but which of these key topics are material to our strategic goals this year? And which things are we going to prioritize in building our program in? So we do it in in two different kind of layers that way, but we're really lucky in that we've got this expertise behind us that's helping us get it right from the get-go. When we started our ESG program, we actually were really thoughtful about which function in the organization we wanted to administer it. And at Risk and Compliance at Benevity, it's a small but mighty team of internal auditors and fraud professionals and cybersecurity professionals. And what this team is really good at, we sort of joke that we're really good at questionnaires, like really, really good at them. One of our big things is we handle all of our 950 enterprise clients' security questionnaires and third-party security reviews. So we have a really good muscle around that. And we decided that the best way to bake in ESG from the get-go in a way that would be really credible and repeatable, producing investor-grade data, was to actually use the risk and compliance team to administer that framework that goes out every year. So just like any of our other assurance programs where we have a team of people who go out in the business and collect the data and then check the data and make sure it's good and then send it up to the reporting entities, we use our risk team for ESG as well, the same thing. So in a lot of ways, when somebody on the team is knocking on a team member's door to say, hey, do you think you could pull the data around our electricity use in these offices, it's not different than when we knock on the door and say, hey, we actually need you to provide this information for this particular control year over year that's going to be externally assured. So in that way, it's really baked. It's just baked into what we do day over day, and the same rigor that's applied for those audit standards is applied to our ESG framework year over year as well.
That's very helpful. Thank you for explaining what your company does. So Kristy, from a legal perspective, can you explain how companies can ensure that ESG strategy is part of a business?
Yes, no, I absolutely. And I think from the legal strategy, that's definitely something really critical on building what Jen was talking about, because what we're seeing, at least in the US side, and I'll give an example with diversity and inclusion, and you may be aware that the Supreme Court had a recent decision striking down affirmative action in the US to higher education. And so this has really raised the issue critically among a lot of different companies and thinking about diversity inclusion. And there's been some different litigation around that. And one of the things that companies are using for diversity inclusion with these goals and metrics that Jen mentioned, right? Because companies following the materiality assessment, then thinking about what the priorities are from those expectations, and then drilling down into the goals and metrics that Jen mentioned, that it's not just a, hey, we're doing a great job, but actually what's our goal, right? What's our target? And, again, that's different for each company, but on the diversity and inclusion piece, for example, what we found is that companies that really take a thoughtful and rigorous look at that and build out those goals metrics, thinking about what that positive impact is, how that moves forward in terms of the company strategy that, like Jen mentioned, then companies can demonstrate that these aren't just goals and metrics that were discussed, but not really action, but really taking that thoughtful look. And so that's part of then creating a structure within the company where we're seeing that a number of public companies, for example, are relooking at their different board committees, right? You've got standard board committees now. Who of those committees are actually looking at ESG? Who's going to have oversight? Perhaps reconsidering committee charters, thinking about establishing a new ESG committee. I mean, it really depends on the company, but at the board level, having that oversight role responsibility, and then thinking about how those goals and metrics are managed on the day-to-day level, if that's through a management committee, a cross-functional executive team, and moving that throughout the organization. So I think those structures are really where companies are having to reset, because again, the analogy there is if you look at disclosures and controls and reporting around financials, and you think of all of the policies and procedures companies have, and now on these non-financial metrics, right? What does that look like? And so we're at this sort of inflection point that companies, with these evolution, that we're moving from these voluntary standards into these more mandatory requirements, how companies are going to reorganize themselves from a governance perspective to address these issues.
Thanks, Kristy. So just while we're speaking with you, and since this is a corporate crime symposium, perhaps you can just briefly touch on some corruption and integrity risks in climate action in particular.
No, absolutely. That's a key question. I know this group has talked about that. It's a huge focus, and I know a lot of you on this call, that's a lot of where you spend a lot of your time. But if we look at the amounts of monies that is involved with trying to address climate change, climate change that Scott mentioned on the investment side, and you think of the literally trillions, we're talking trillions of dollars that are going to be invested and look to be invested around the world in terms of trying to address climate change and these environmental social issues. And I can't imagine anyone hearing that number, especially if you're in the anti-corruption, anti-bribery space, thinking about what type of concern and risk that could cause, because we're spending money and hiring, for example, certain consultants or third parties, and maybe they're not actually doing what they say they're supposed to be doing. They may not have the expertise that they say they are, and if it's something related to some corruption issues, again, revisiting policy, procedures, controls, due diligence around that is going to be really critical to make sure that you're addressing these issues from an ethics and integrity standpoint, given the breadth of what we're seeing here.
Thanks, Kristy. So Scott, let's go back to you. Can you share with us some considerations in relation to boards' responsibility vis-a-vis climate-related disclosures?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Kristy kind of, laid it up pretty good in terms of, and we're seeing the exact same thing. There is a little bit of mixed practice out there, and boards and those charged with governance are really rethinking, like, who is responsible for this and who is responsible for what element of ESG. I would say traditionally it hasn't really been in the responsibility of those charged with governance. Is that changing, and is that rapidly changing? Absolutely. But what we're starting to see is, there's a lot more eyes on this type of information. There's a lot more scrutiny, certainly in the marketplace. Kristy also mentioned some of the SEC fines, some of the lawsuits that have happened around greenwashing as well. So what we're actually seeing is the board divvy up different responsibilities within the ESG. So, often you might have your risk committee looking at some of the ERM and how are these, sustainability risks impacting the company. The board might from an overall strategy, but where we're starting to see a big trend on the disclosure front, and you mentioned, Amy, climate-related disclosures, is the audit committee. So the audit committee continues to play a much more active role in reviewing the information that is going out in the marketplace and approving it. Very, very similar to what they do for financial statements and MD&A and other type of filing documents. So, a trend that at least we're starting to see is management setting up their own little disclosure committees to review the information, making sure they're comfortable with it, it's verifiable before mailing it to the board for kind of final approval. And I would say the audit committee in particular is playing a more active role, I would say, in the North American markets. But interestingly enough, in the European markets with the new regulation, the CSRD coming down, they actually specifically call out the audit committee. And they call it the audit committee as playing a key role, and their expectation is that they'll oversee sustainability reporting and ensure that, again, it's reliable, there's the right controls and processes that are in place. And again, a very, very similar function to what we're seeing audit committees do for financial statements. And a big part of that too is building up the capabilities, not just in the board, but as well as across the other committees like the audit committee, the risk committees. So we continue to see, requests from clients that we work with around board education to help build up those capabilities so that they're, again, well positioned to oversee some of this information.
Scott. Kristy, do you have anything to add about how the ESG movement is impacting governance practices?
I would say the other area that we see emerging through this too is on the merger and acquisition M&A side. With governance, we talk about controls in terms of different supplier, business partners, and targets controls in the company metrics. But on the merger acquisition side, right, thinking about how to incorporate that into a standard M&A due diligence checklist, and now thinking about the ESG due diligence that's involved. And of course, there's always been environmental, right, due diligence review and M&A, of course, but this is something more specific to thinking about if companies have they taken these steps, right? And have they looked at their stakeholders and understand what their legal requirements are, and how are they moving this forward, because it could impact value with potential for acquisition for the future and just what you're inheriting there. So I would just say that the M&A space, for those of you who work in that, it's something else to consider as this moves forward and it's evolving.
Thanks, Kristy. So Jen, how has your company's existing principles and practices relating to good governance helped shape your ESG practice and operations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just to Kristy's point, I was going to mention that as part of our latest raise with our existing impact investors here, I think they're ahead of the curve, obviously, on these topics. So as part of that due diligence exercise, there was a whole section there that just dealt specifically with ESG risks, and it was really fascinating to see the kind of normal due diligence processes that you expect to see on all these transactions replicated, but for a different subject matter, right? So all of a sudden we're going out in the business and pulling different data, right, that we maybe wouldn't expect to normally pull for a transaction. And what that really did for us actually was it's really the start of your ESG program in a lot of ways, because you start pulling your data as part of that exercise, and then you build a machine around how to collect it year over year in a systematized way that's credible. And so it's if it happens to any of you and you've got a due diligence exercise that includes ESG, the first time it's a little new and novel, but once you get through that first one, it's very similar to everything else that you do. So it's not something to be kind of worried or scared about. At Benevity, we recognize, like anything we do, whether it's SOC 1 or SOC 2 for our financial controls or cybersecurity controls, that the tone at the top is really critical for success of any of the objectives of these programs. And so we have a really good, healthy kind of mutualism between the business and the teams that are doing this work and our boards and our executive team. One of the unique things that we do here is for our standard board reporting, we include at the front a slide that includes our impact metrics. So it's front and center, it's top of mind, it's something that's always brought up at every single engagement when we're speaking with our board. And in that way, it really helps create, I think, a context in which we're all clear on what the priorities of the business are in and above our financial goals, right? It really puts them on kind of equal footing. And then the executives on our team, of course, are same thing. It's top of mind. It gets equal billing in our quarterly business reviews. It's front and center all the time. So I think creating those processes that allow you time and time again to bring ESG to the forefront and make sure it's top of mind and not sort of an afterthought or just something that you think about when it's time to go report, has helped to set us up in terms of evolving our ESG program year over year and really making improvements against it. And it really, the one thing I have noticed is that as lawyers and as risk professionals, we can kind of straddle, right, the business and the operations and understand what work that's going on there and speak with those teams and help them set up their controls and really get in the weeds. But we also kind of understand the love language of our executive teams and our boards of directors. And so we're great translators of saying, this is why this is important, and here's how you're going to drive value. And really connecting those dots and making sure that the antenna and the signals are really lined up well to drive really successful programs. So the risk teams and the lawyers and your powerful advocates in the business who understand both sides are really good from that point of view as well.
Great tips and some language in there that I will never forget. Okay, litigation and reputational risks are significant concerns to all, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about, what some of those risks are and what some of the best practices are out there for companies to avoid those types of litigation and reputational risks. Kristy, can you speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. I know that's always top of mind after everything that Jen described. Then it's always the question, okay, well, what's the litigation and what potential are we facing on the regulatory side? So we touched on this a little bit, but on the regulatory side, again, I just mentioned because with the SEC now, with the task force that's been in place, there's, the focus around what companies are reporting. So again, what companies place on their website, for example. And so there's concern, and there's a Brazilian company that has an enforcement action related to some of the statements that were made related to safety issues for workers. And it's just an example to demonstrate the rigor that Jen was talking about in terms of thinking through what the process would be in a company to really validate, make sure it's accurate, verifiable, and so on to look at. Because otherwise, if there is a type of enforcement action like that, there will be, that look at what you said and what you're actually doing. And the same thing on the litigation side. Of course, we've seen a number of litigation lawsuits around the same thing for claims, these words around, sustainable business practice and such, and these words that maybe your advertising teams or marketing teams are putting together. They're making these different claims, but then what exactly does that mean, and is it verifiable? And so bringing in the lawyers, there's a lot of preemptive, proactive green claims review advisory going on right now to take a look to see, what does it look like in the litigation space? Are we at a concern, in terms of consumers questioning, some of these claims? So those are just some examples for companies to take a look at and ways they can try to get ahead of that internally. And I know that a lot of clients are looking to understand that better, so that there's that proactive piece, which is really critical.
Thanks, Kristy. So Scott, can you share what some non-legal methods exist to mitigate risks and gain some assurance that ESG practices are sound?
Yeah, well, you kind of said it in the question as well. ESG assurance is certainly something that we're seeing an increase of calls for, to make the information more credible and even combating some of that perception of greenwashing. And just to kind of add to Kristy's comments as well too, and I'm sure many of the audience has seen on the news, the SEC is laid out fines to organizations for some of their greenwashing. I think we're going to continue to see that. I know even in the Canadian markets, they've highlighted greenwashing is a concern from our regulators, and something they're going to continue to monitor and enforce. And yes, some of the fines, come out, and it might be a couple $1 million for these, billion-dollar companies, but the reputational risk is a lot more damaging, I would say, as it relates to some of that. So we're really seeing companies be a little bit more proactive. There's certainly calls for more and more ESG information, but increasingly there's calls for more credible ESG information. And just to kind of reference a study, so IOSCO did a global investor kind of engagement, and one of the critical things that was expected from the investor community is they want to see reliable sustainability information that's being assured. So as a result of that, we are seeing even regulation pop up around the world requiring some of this ESG information to be assured. So it was included in the SEC proposal to have some assurance over the greenhouse gas emissions, the California one, which Kristy was talking about earlier on, as well as the European one. So that's certainly kind of direction of travel. This information is not only being asked to be reported from a regulatory perspective, but it's also being asked from a assurance perspective as well too. I'll comment right now from a Canadian perspective as well. Right now, there is no requirement for ESG assurance in the Canadian marketplace. However, it's a matter of when and not if, and that's really driven by what we've seen develop globally. And then on the assurance side in general, I would also say that the market's moving a little bit earlier than the regulation. So we support a lot of organizations on the ESG assurance front, and what I would say is that we're getting lots of different requests to help support that, because companies want to be proactive on it, and they're putting this information out there. They want to show that they're making progress against certain targets, and again, adding that credibility, and it really helps to build trust with their stakeholders that are looking and using this information. But with all that being said, there's a bit of a hurdle to get some of this information ready for assurance. Financial information has been assured for many years. It's robust controls, much better data, and we're not quite there yet in the sustainability space. So it is a little bit of a runway to get this information to that same quality level as what we even have for financial reporting. But what we're really seeing a lot of organizations focus on is getting their sustainability reporting and information ready for formal assurance. So focusing on fundamental things like, where's the data coming from? Is it reliable? What's the quality of it? And where there's not data, building in estimation processes and making sure those estimation processes are sound and, again, based on best market practices. And then a big part is, and we talked a little bit about early on, is building up that governance, controls, and process environment is pretty critical, again, to help prepare for that. And not only for, third-party assurance, but again, helping get management reliability of this over this information, especially if they're using it for, decision-making purposes or allocation of capital and areas like that. So certainly a way I would say that we're starting to see organizations kind of mitigate that risk is getting, third-party assurance.
Thanks so much, Scott. So, Jen, businesses have a unique position because obviously they have to balance competing risks in a relatively new space where innovation is needed to be effective. So how is Benevity dealing with that tension?
Yeah, and there is tension. I mean, I think it's the tension that exists in every in-house law department writ large, right? You have a compliance requirement that's new, and you've got to figure out what it means for the business and make sure that the business is protected and the risks are reasonably managed and mitigated. That's our job. That's what we're there to do to help the business. But I think ESG and sustainability presents a really amazing opportunity for these professionals because it's really, you could get in the door with your exec teams by saying, here's all the scary risks and the litigation risks and the greenwashing, and it's a compliance requirement. But once you've got the foothold, really you've got this amazing opportunity to help be a change leader in your organization. What ESG and sustainability writ large is asking the space to do is to look at its existing status quo practices and shift its thinking around it, right? Away from just that traditional, extractive, profit at all costs kind of mentality that really has led us to some pretty dire circumstances for people, planet, and also for businesses writ large. It's asking us to shift that perspective in a pretty major way, which involves pretty skilled change leaders. And I think, I'm biased, but I think lawyers and risk folks are really uniquely positioned to drive meaningful change because they understand the language of risk, and they also understand that risk is not just about harm reduction, but value creation. Right? The flip side of your strategy is often looking at your risks. That's what ERM is all about. So you can take, your expertise and your skills and your advocacy skills and really drive change and innovation. And if we focus, I think, too much on the negative aspects of it around the fines that can happen, and I think we'll lose the plot. I think we'll lose the whole purpose of ESG and the essence of it, which is really to help organizations step into the space of being purpose driven from top to bottom and have it baked right into their DNA. So you can use your audit teams and your audit committees and your risk teams to help drive this really powerful, meaningful change. But I think it's going to require us as risk leaders and lawyers to stretch ourselves in some ways, right? Because we're so used to going, our job is really, we're doing a super great job if we're, managing the risks in the business, but it's going to ask us to be that true business partner to our exec teams and our boards to say, let me, hold your hand in your strategy and help drive it through ESG and sustainability. So at Benevity, we're an innovative company through and through, or B Corp. We bleed ESG and sustainability. So it's not a big leap over here. I don't have to convince anybody of the ethos of it. But we're still a business. We still have the same financial pressures and the same risk considerations. We manage, I think we're over $10 billion in donations across the world to date. And so we have a lot of responsibility around that to our community as well. So acknowledging there is a tension, you have to do both well all the time. And I think it's going to require us to really step up our game in our in-house departments.
So that's a really great way to summarize and sum up what we've been discussing today. Right now is supposed to be the Q&A time. We really just have a couple of minutes left. So maybe I can just ask a question. I'll leave it open to whoever wants to answer. But what should a person who knows that this is important, but they have an executive team that may not be as knowledgeable yet? So how can they explain why this is important and why they need to retain experts or hire someone with knowledge in order to conduct ESG reporting?
Yeah, no, I think if you're in a position in your company where this is, you're looking at the regulatory requirements, but you maybe are still kind of early on in your purpose journey or you're early on in your ESG journey, I think the best thing you can do is really, like, there's a huge community of organizations out there that have done this in the weeds. There's lots of investor consortiums that are front of the line thought leaders in this space. I would work with a professional, like I would get your legal team and your risk professionals and your auditor, all those folks on board really, really early to bake it into your DNA and your processes. And really, once you've set the foundation, it becomes just an annual process that there's a cadence and a rhythm and predictability. And so you can see that incremental progress over time.
Kristy, did you want to add something? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Scott.
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I was going to jump. I would say it's becoming increasingly less difficult to convince, because I think the C-suite recognize this is a very topical issue. There's regulation coming, and yes, there's going to be companies that take different approaches, and there's going to be ones that strategy-led ESG and really embedding ESG in what they do in their operation. And you're going to have the bucket of organizations that are just compliance focused, so doing the bare minimum. But with that being said, with what's coming on the regulatory side, everyone's going to be in the position that they need to do something. So I think from that perspective, the C-suite recognize that there is going to be, resources and effort that need to help support this. And, what we're finding even at PwC is that I reflect on it, we have our own ESG ambitions at PwC. We put out our trust roadmap, and we've had a ton of interest from employees who want to get involved, which is a very positive thing, I would say. And even for some of the ESG roles that we're putting out to universities, we've a lot of applicants who are applying to these roles because the next generation want to get involved. So I think there's a strong message there that employees and these businesses that are so reliant on their people, it's a really good way to get people motivated and involved in something that's important.
Thank you. I mean, I think that all of you shared so much information. We are at time, so I just want to thank the panelists for your insights, your thoughtful analysis to really help unpack this evolving landscape. And I want to thank all of you for attending today. And we look forward to the next stage of this evolving landscape. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.